Imagine, not just any company. Forget for a moment about the modern giants like Amazon or Google, however all-powerful they might seem. Picture a corporation that didn't just optimize logistics or search algorithms. Imagine an entity possessing its own professional army, outnumbering and outgunning the armed forces of many sovereign nations of its time. A corporation that independently declared wars on powerful empires and kingdoms, negotiated and signed peace treaties on par with monarchs. A company that minted its own currency, recognized across vast territories, and governed, directly or indirectly, the fates of hundreds of millions on the other side of the globe, dictating laws and collecting taxes. Sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel or an alternate history? Perhaps. But my friends, this isn't fiction. This was the British East India Company, the Honorable East India Company, HEIC. And it wasn't a fabrication, but a very real, often brutal, but undeniably captivating reality that fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history. We're used to thinking of corporations as economic entities. They sell us goods and services, from smartphones and coffee to insurance policies and software. At best, or worst, they lobby for their interests in the halls of power, influencing legislation. But for a private company, founded by a group of investors, to own entire countries, effectively turning them into assets? For its shareholders, meeting in luxurious London City boardrooms to decide who would rule in Delhi or Mysore, deposing Rajas and Nawabs at their whim? The very idea seems wild, absurd, impossible. And yet, this is precisely how the East India Company operated at the height of its power. The story of this unique mega-corporation isn't just a collection of dusty historical facts. It's a key to understanding the very foundations of the modern world. Globalization in its early, aggressive form. The phenomenon of corporate power extending far beyond economics. The clash of civilizations. The ruthless exploitation of entire continents' resources. The birth and inevitable collapse of empires built on the thirst for profit. All these themes, resonating with our reality today, have their roots right there. In the stuffy, spice-scented holds of East India Company ships, on the blood-soaked battlefields of Bengal, the Carnatic, and the Punjab, and in the quiet opulence of the offices on Leadenhall Street in London. To understand it is to understand the relentless flywheel of history, how private ambition, magnified by organizational might and military force, can redraw maps, shatter civilizations, and forge new world orders. So, make yourselves comfortable. We're embarking on a journey filled with intrigue, riches, blood, and consequences that are still felt today. Things aren't just about to get hot. They're about to get scorching. It all began, as great and terrible enterprises often do, quite prosaically, driven by a simple human desire: to make money. The year was 1600. A group of 218 enterprising London merchants and aristocrats gathered, likely in some tavern, and their conversation might have sounded something like this. "Damn it all, those Dutch and Portuguese are raking in fortunes trading with the East Indies. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon. They fetch gold in Europe, but they bring them back from there for pennies. Are we Englishmen inferior? Will we really let them completely control this source of fabulous profits? Envy and commercial drive, powerful engines of progress, and not just progress. And so, on the cusp of the new 17th century, December 31st, 1600, the aging Queen Elizabeth I, Tudor herself, granted them her royal blessing, a royal charter. This document was essentially carte blanche. Gentlemen, go forth to the east, trade, beat your competitors, establish a monopoly on trade between the Cape of Good Hope and the Strait of Magellan in England's name, and the Crown will support and protect you. This new organization was grandly, if somewhat cumbersomely, named the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Sounds impressive, but in reality, it was just a group of investors who pooled capital to outfit a few ships, essentially a private joint stock company. The first expeditions were true gambles, a dance with death. Imagine these frail wooden vessels, the East Indiaman ships, facing months of grueling voyages across stormy, uncharted seas. They faced threats not only from storms and reefs, but also pirates of all stripes, diseases like scurvy and dysentery that decimated crews, and of course, hostile competitors. The Dutch, through their powerful Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and the Portuguese already had a network of factories, trading posts, and established routes, and they clung fiercely to their monopoly, not hesitating to engage in armed conflict. Far from all the company's ships returned to London, far from all the sailors who set out dreaming of riches ever saw their native shores again. But the few vessels that did manage to break through and return brought back cargo that repaid all the risks and losses many times over. Pepper, cloves, textiles, indigo, goods bought for next to nothing in India sold in London at markups of hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of %. Shareholders in the city rubbed their hands together with glee, calculating their dividends. For the first few decades, the company operated primarily as intended, as a trading organization. They patiently, step by step, established small fortified trading posts, factories on the Indian coast. Surat in the west, the first major factory. Madras, where Fort St. George was built. Bombay, an island received by Charles II as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry and leased to the company for a symbolic $10 in gold per year. And of course, Calcutta in Bengal, founded by Job Charnock. Their primary task was to secure the favor of local rulers, vassals or governors of the Mughal Empire, to obtain a firman, a decree or permit, for trade, duty-free or preferential passage for goods, purchase sought-after goods, besides spices, Indian cotton and silk fabrics, chintz, muslin, renowned for their quality and patterns, gained incredible popularity in Europe, load them into the ship's holds, and send them on the long voyage home. They competed with other European companies, sometimes leading to local skirmishes and sea battles. But generally, they tried to position themselves as peaceful merchants useful to local authorities. In India itself, the 17th century was still dominated by the mighty, though beginning to experience internal strains, Mughal Empire. To the Padishahs in Delhi or Agra, these pale-faced Europeans huddled in their coastal factories were just one of many groups of foreign merchants, occasionally bothersome, but generally useful as they brought silver and paid duties. No one at the Mughal court could have imagined that these hat-wearers, as they were sometimes dismissively called, would eventually evolve into a force that would swallow their empire whole. They were a grain of sand on the vast beach of Indian civilization, politics, and military might. But this grain of sand possessed a unique internal structure and DNA. It was organized as a joint stock company capable of accumulating vast private capital, acting with a long-term strategic goal, profit, and displaying remarkable focus and flexibility. And crucially, it was fueled by an insatiable thirst for profit that pushed it towards ever greater risks and bolder moves. Let's fast forward a century to the early 18th century. The picture on the Indian subcontinent begins to change dramatically. The mighty Mughal Empire, which for nearly 2 centuries had provided relative stability and unity across much of India, starts to fray at the seams and crumble from within. The death of the last strong Padishah, Aurangzeb, in 1707 catalyzed this process. Thus began a long period of succession wars in Delhi, rebellions by powerful provincial governors, Nawabs and Subadars, in places like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, who effectively became independent rulers, paying only lip service to the weakening emperor. The Indian subcontinent plunges into a state that Thomas Hobbes would call a war of all against all. The Maratha Confederacy gains strength in the west, challenging the Mughals. The Persian Nadir Shah carries out a devastating raid on Delhi in 1739, hauling away immense treasures, including the famous Peacock Throne, and dealing a mortal blow to the empire's prestige. And in this boiling cauldron of disintegration and chaos, our humble London merchants from the East India Company begin to see not just threats to their business, but dizzying, unprecedented opportunities. Previously, they had to bow humbly to Mughal officials, seek audiences, pay bribes and duties, and endure arbitrary treatment and extortion from local authorities. But now, the situation was turning upside down. Local rulers, fighting each other for power or trying to assert their independence from Delhi, were themselves desperately seeking allies. And the company happened to have exactly what they vitally needed. First, money, loans, subsidies, and second, increasingly important, small but superbly disciplined, well-trained detachments of soldiers armed with the latest European military technology. Initially, the company hired armed guards, often locals called sepoys, from the Persian sipahi, warrior, commanded by European officers, purely to protect its factories, warehouses, and trade caravans from bandits, pirates, and aggressive competitors. These were relatively small garrisons. But amidst the widespread chaos and the weakening of traditional Indian armies, these compact, disciplined units with their rapid-firing muskets and effective artillery suddenly became an incredibly weighty factor in the complex game of local politics. Picture a typical scenario. One Indian Nawab or Raja is at war with his neighbor over disputed territory or the throne. Then a company agent appears, polite but persistent, and says something like, "Your Highness, we see your difficulties. We are prepared to help you. Our soldiers and our cannons are at your service. We will support you in your just struggle. And when you are victorious, and with our help, you surely will be, you will simply do us a small favor. Grant exclusive trading privileges in your lands, exempt company goods from all duties, perhaps cede control over tax collection in a couple of districts to cover our expenses, and of course, a small reward for our valiant officers and soldiers for their troubles." Tempting? For a ruler on the brink of defeat, absolutely. And so, the company begins to intervene more and more actively in local dynastic disputes and internecine wars. It supports one claimant to a throne against another, skillfully plays on the rivalries between different Indian states, forms complex military-political alliances, and then, when its protege achieves victory, often solely thanks to the decisive role of company soldiers, it presents him with the bill. And with each iteration, the bill gets bigger and the demands more audacious. This was no longer just trade in spices and textiles. This was high politics. This was a game of survival, dominance, and gradual subjugation. It's worth noting that the French, through their own French East India Company, were also actively trying to play the same game, especially in the south of India, in the Carnatic. A fierce struggle for influence unfolded between the British and the French in India, a true proxy war where they backed opposing Indian factions and fought each other, using their allies and small forces of their own. It was, in essence, the Indian theater of the global Anglo-French rivalry that simmered across the world, from North America to Europe. And the key figure symbolizing and accelerating this transformation of merchants into warriors, politicians, and the future rulers of India was a man whose name would echo around the world: Robert Clive. Robert Clive, a name that for some became a symbol of British valor and the genius who built an empire, and for others, a synonym for the treachery, avarice, and ruthless colonial expansion of the East India Company. His path was truly cinematic. He started in 1744 as a very ordinary, low-paid clerk, a writer, at the company's factory in Madras. They say he suffered from depression, hated his monotonous job, missed his homeland, and even twice attempted suicide out of despair and hopelessness. The pistol misfired both times. Fate clearly had other plans for him. But it turned out that within this sullen young man lay dormant a hidden genius, a genius for warfare and political intrigue. In the chaos of the so-called Carnatic Wars, mid-18th century, where the British and French, led by their talented Governor Dupleix, backed different claimants to the thrones of the Nawab of the Carnatic and the Nizam of Hyderabad, Clive got his chance to shine. Transferring to the company's military service, he demonstrated incredible personal bravery, audacity in planning, and talent as a commander. His legendary defense of Arcot in 1751, when with a handful of soldiers, around 500 men, including sepoys, he withstood a 50-day siege by an enemy army numbering thousands, became a turning point in the war and made him a celebrated hero. This episode clearly showed that small, well-trained, disciplined, and decisively led European and European-trained sepoy detachments could successfully stand against much larger, but poorly organized and often fragmented traditional Indian armies. But Clive's true moment of glory and the decisive turning point in the entire history of the East India Company came in Bengal, the richest and most populous province of India, its economic jewel. In 1756, the young, ambitious, and inexperienced Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, irritated by the growing influence and high-handedness of the British, they began fortifying Fort William in Calcutta without his permission, fearing the French harbored his enemies and evaded taxes by abusing trade privileges. Decided to put the arrogant merchants in their place. He gathered a large army and swiftly captured Calcutta. It was then that the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident occurred. According to the British account, told by one of the survivors, John Holwell, some 146 British prisoners, men, women, and children, were forced into a tiny prison cell at Fort William and left there overnight. By morning, only about 23 had survived the horrific crush and suffocation. Although the exact number of victims and even the deliberate nature of the act are disputed by many historians, it may have been a tragic accident or an exaggeration, the story was immediately seized upon by the company as powerful propaganda to justify revenge and further aggression. The outrage in Madras was immense. The company decided not just to recapture Calcutta, but to punish Siraj-ud-Dowlah, placed in command of the punitive expedition sent by sea from Madras, was who? None other than the hero of Arcot, Robert Clive, now a lieutenant colonel. Clive arrived in Bengal in early 1757 and quickly recaptured Calcutta with minimal losses. But he understood perfectly well, simply restoring the status quo was a half measure. To secure the company's long-term interests and gain full control over Bengal's riches, the troublesome Siraj-ud-Dowlah had to be removed and replaced with a puppet ruler completely obedient to the company's will. And Clive, a master of intrigue no less than of the battlefield, embarked on a complex and risky scheme. He entered into a secret conspiracy with a group of disgruntled courtiers and military commanders under the Nawab, chief among them Mir Jafar, commander of a large part of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army and his relative. Clive promised Mir Jafar the throne of Bengal in exchange for his betrayal at the decisive moment of battle. The price of the deal was enormous. Mir Jafar pledged to pay the company a colossal indemnity, compensate all losses, grant new privileges, and generously reward all key company officials, including Clive himself. The culmination of this drama was the Battle of Plassey, Palashi, on June 23, 1757. Clive had only about 3,000 soldiers, fewer than a third of whom were Europeans, British soldiers and sailors. The rest were sepoys loyal to the company. His artillery was small but effective. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had a huge army. Estimates range from 40,000 to 50,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and powerful artillery, partly commanded by French officers. On paper, the forces were utterly mismatched. Clive stood no chance. But a large portion of the Nawab's army, commanded by the conspirator Mir Jafar and his associates, simply stood idle during the battle, observing the events just as agreed with Clive. Only the few units remaining loyal to Siraj-ud-Dowlah and the French artillerymen fought actively. After a relatively short but intense battle, the outcome decided by several factors: a sudden downpour that soaked the Bengali artillery's powder, but was kept dry by the British thanks to tarpaulins, effective British artillery fire, the passivity of the bulk of the Nawab's army, and finally, the death of one of Siraj's loyal commanders. The Nawab's army wavered and began a disorderly retreat. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled the battlefield, but was soon captured and treacherously killed on the orders of Mir Jafar's son. Mir Jafar, as promised, was proclaimed the new Nawab of Bengal and the East India Company. Overnight, it transformed from a group of merchants, however influential, into the de facto master of the richest and strategically most important province in India. The Battle of Plassey was not just a military victory achieved through cunning and betrayal over superior forces. It was, in essence, a coup d'etat carried out by a private commercial corporation using military force and political intrigue. From this moment on, the East India Company definitively ceased to be merely a trader seeking profit. It became a sovereign power, making and unmaking kings, collecting tribute, and dictating its will to entire peoples. The foundations of the British Empire in India had been laid. The victory at Plassey, won more by intrigue and betrayal than by sheer military force, opened the floodgates for the unprecedented enrichment of the East India Company and its employees. Mir Jafar, placed on the throne of Bengal by Clive, found himself completely dependent on his benefactors. He was forced to pay astronomical sums to the company and its top officials as compensation for mythical or real losses in Calcutta, as well as direct gifts for the support rendered. The treasury of Bengal, one of the richest in India, was virtually emptied by this plunder. Robert Clive personally received enormous sums of money and lands, a jaghir, instantly becoming one of the wealthiest men in England. Many other company employees followed his example, returning home with colossal fortunes amassed in India, often through dishonest means: bribery, extortion, private trade bypassing the company's own interests. These nouveaux riches became contemptuously known in England as nabobs, a corruption of the Indian nawab. They were condemned for their ostentatious luxury, coarse manners, and the dubious origins of their wealth, yet many envied their success and influence. However, Mir Jafar, despite his dependence, proved not to be quite the pliable puppet the company had hoped for. He tried to somehow limit the insatiable appetites of the British, even seeking support from their competitors, the Dutch. The company, naturally, disliked this. In 1760, the British unceremoniously deposed Mir Jafar and installed his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, in his place. At first, he seemed more cooperative. He dutifully paid tribute to the company and ceded several more districts to it. But Mir Qasim was an intelligent and energetic ruler. He attempted reforms to strengthen his authority and finances. He moved the capital from Murshidabad, right next to Calcutta, to the more distant Munger, began reorganizing the army along European lines, tried to regulate trade and curb the abuses by company employees engaged in duty-free private trade, which was ruining local merchants and the Nawab's treasury. And what do you think happened? As soon as Mir Qasim tried to assert independence and protect the interests of his state, the company declared war on him. In 1763-1764, company troops defeated Mir Qasim's army in several battles, including the decisive Battle of Buxar, 1764, where he fought in alliance with the Nawab of Awadh and even the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II himself. The victory at Buxar was even more significant militarily than Plassey, as the company defeated the combined forces of three influential rulers in open combat. After the defeat, Mir Qasim fled, and the company restored the old, infirm, and now utterly compliant Mir Jafar to the throne. This cynical game of musical chairs with rulers clearly demonstrated to everyone in India who now held the real power in Bengal and beyond. The culmination of this process of the company transforming into a sovereign power came in 1765. Robert Clive, having returned to India for a second term as governor of Bengal to sort out the company's affairs, including combating corruption among its employees, secured from the nominal but still legitimate Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, who, after the defeat at Buxar, was effectively a British prisoner, the signing of the historic Treaty of Allahabad. Under this treaty, the East India Company received the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. What was the Diwani? It was nothing less than the right to collect all land revenues and administer the finances of these three richest provinces of India. Just grasp the scale of this event. A private trading corporation based in London officially receives, with the sanction of the Mughal emperor, the right to collect taxes from tens of millions of inhabitants across a vast territory. Meanwhile, formal administration, maintaining order, and the judicial system, the so-called Nizamat, remained nominally in the hands of the Nawab of Bengal. This created the so-called dual system of government, extremely advantageous for the company. It gained full financial power and revenue, but bore no direct responsibility for the welfare of the population or the administration of the territory. The Nawab, deprived of finances, became a purely nominal figurehead, receiving a fixed stipend from the company. And the money, all the vast tax revenues, now flowed directly into the coffers of the East India Company. It was a scheme brilliant from the perspective of the company and its shareholders, and simultaneously monstrous from the perspective of the Indian population. The company gained access to colossal financial resources, which could now be used not only to pay huge dividends to shareholders in London and enrich its employees, but also to finance its ever-growing army, wage further wars of conquest in India, and, most cynically, to purchase Indian goods, textiles, saltpeter, opium, for shipment to Europe and China. That is, Indian goods were now effectively being bought with money collected from Indians themselves as taxes. It was a closed loop of self-financing colonization and exploitation. The consequences for Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa were catastrophic. The tax burden increased sharply as the company and its rapacious agents were interested only in maximizing short-term profits, regardless of long-term consequences. Traditional crafts, especially the production of famous Bengali muslins and silks, began to decline. The British increasingly demanded raw materials, raw cotton, opium, indigo, for their own growing industries, rather than finished Indian goods that could compete with the products of British factories. The apotheosis of this predatory rule was the Great Bengal Famine of 1769–1770, lasting until 1773. A catastrophic drought and crop failure were vastly exacerbated by the company's ruthless tax policies. Taxes continued to be collected in full and sometimes increased, even from starving regions. Grain speculation by company officials and their local collaborators, and the disruption of traditional irrigation and support systems. The result was the death of an estimated 7 to 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's population. The company, the de facto ruler of the region collecting its wealth, did practically nothing to alleviate the suffering of the starving. Its main concern remained tax collection and ensuring profits. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale, caused by a combination of natural factors and human greed and incompetence. News of the famine's horrors reached Britain and shocked parts of British society, sparking the first serious debates about the nature of the East India Company's rule and the need for government control over its activities. It became clear that the trading company had turned into an out-of-control monster. Having acquired the Diwani of Bengal, the East India Company was definitively and irrevocably transformed. It morphed into something unique and unprecedented in world history, a hybrid of a commercial firm and a sovereign state, a private enterprise with imperial ambitions and capabilities. Its structure became increasingly complex, branched, and bureaucratized, attempting to cope with the new tasks of governing vast territories and millions of people. In London, on Leadenhall Street, it was still formally governed by the Court of Directors, consisting of 24 members elected by the shareholders, the Court of Proprietors. However, the British Parliament, concerned by the company's growing power and the scandals surrounding it, corruption, the Bengal famine, began to gradually intervene in its affairs, passing regulating acts, like the Act of 1773. These introduced the post of Governor General of Bengal. Warren Hastings was the first, with some authority over the other presidencies, Madras and Bombay, and established a Supreme Court in Calcutta. Attempting to impose some crown control over the company's actions. But in India, meanwhile, a whole administrative hierarchy was burgeoning. The Governor-General in Calcutta, whose authority eventually extended over all company-controlled India, governors in Madras and Bombay, numerous residents at the courts of dependent Indian princes, collectors, tax collectors, judges, customs officials, police officers. The company created its own laws, its own courts, often applying different legal standards to Europeans and Indians, its own police force, and prisons. But the main, indestructible pillar of its power was its army. The East India Company's army grew exponentially, financed by Indian taxes. If in the mid-18th century it comprised relatively small forces numbering tens of thousands, by the early 19th century, it had become one of the largest and most effective regular armies in the world, numbering over 250,000 soldiers. The bulk of this army, its backbone, consisted of sepoys, Indian soldiers recruited from the local population. They were often recruited from specific regions and high castes like Rajputs and Brahmins from Awadh, known for their martial traditions. Sepoys were trained in European battle tactics, armed with modern muskets and rifles, wore European-style uniforms, and were commanded by British officers. There were also regiments composed entirely of Europeans, soldiers recruited in Britain or other European countries, considered the army's elite. This powerful military machine was an instrument not only for defending already captured territories and the company's commercial interests, but, above all, for continuous methodical expansion. Using the tried and tested tactic of divide and rule, divide et impera, skillfully playing on age-old rivalries between Indian principalities and dynasties, provoking conflicts, and then intervening on one side, the company waged almost constant warfare throughout the late 18th and first half of the 19th centuries. The fierce Mysore Wars, 1767-1799, against the talented and tenacious rulers Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan. The legendary Tiger of Mysore, one of the Britishers' most formidable opponents, eventually killed during the storming of his capital, Seringapatam. The grueling Maratha Wars, 1775-1818, against the powerful but fragmented confederacy of Maratha principalities, which had long been the dominant power in central and western India. The capture of Delhi in 1803, although the blind and powerless Mughal emperor remained on the throne for some time as a British puppet. The annexation of the wealthy Punjab after two bloody Sikh wars, 1845-1849, which broke their powerful state created by Ranjit Singh. Step by step, battle by battle, treaty by treaty, often imposed by force, the company subjugated almost the entire Indian subcontinent, either ruling it directly, British India, or through a system of subsidiary alliances with local rulers who lost their foreign policy independence and had to maintain contingents of company troops at their own expense. Often, a convenient pretext for the direct annexation of Indian states was the so-called Doctrine of Lapse, actively applied by Governor-General Lord Dalhousie in the 1840s-50s. According to this doctrine, if the ruler of a state dependent on the company died without leaving a direct male blood heir, his state was automatically annexed by the company. the traditional Indian right to adopt an heir, widely practiced for centuries, was cynically disregarded. This policy caused enormous resentment and fear among the Indian aristocracy, who were losing their domains and status. And where did the colossal funds, collected as taxes from conquered lands and obtained as war indemnities, go? Of course, the lion's share went to maintaining the gigantic army and the bloated administrative apparatus, building strategic roads and communications, paying dividends to shareholders in London, and pensions to retired employees. But there was another, extremely important and particularly sinister source of income closely linked to the company's expansion: opium. The company established a strict monopoly on the cultivation of opium poppies and the production of opium in its territories, especially in Bengal and Bihar. Indian peasants were often forced or economically incentivized to grow opium poppies instead of traditional food crops, which had devastating consequences for local agriculture and food security. Where was this drug, produced on an industrial scale, headed? The main market became China. The British had a huge demand for Chinese goods: tea, which had become the national drink, silk, porcelain. However, the Chinese needed almost nothing from European industrial goods. This resulted in a colossal trade imbalance. Silver flowed out of Britain and India into China to pay for Chinese imports. And the East India Company found a cynical and destructive solution to this problem: illegally smuggling vast quantities of Indian opium into China. The goal was twofold. First, to create mass demand for opium in China, addicting millions of people to the drug, and second, to receive silver for the opium, which could then be used to purchase tea and other Chinese goods. This scheme led to the catastrophic narcotization of Chinese society, the destruction of its social fabric and economy, and ultimately to the two Opium Wars, 1839-1842 and 1856-1860, during which Britain, supported by other Western powers, forced China's Qing government at gunpoint to legalize the opium trade and grant humiliating trade and territorial concessions to foreigners. Just imagine the sheer cynicism of this global operation. A private company ruling India uses its resources and population to produce a drug, which it then sells illegally in another sovereign country to balance its tea trade. And all this brings fabulous profits and geopolitical advantage to it and the British Crown. This was international drug trafficking elevated to the level of state, or rather corporate policy, built on exploitation, violence, and complete disregard for human lives and the sovereignty of other nations. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company's dominion over India seemed to have reached its zenith and appeared absolutely unshakable. Directly or indirectly, it controlled almost the entire subcontinent, from the Himalayas in the north to Cape Comorin in the south, from Burma in the east, which it had also begun to conquer, to the borders of Afghanistan in the west. Its army was considered invincible after a string of triumphant victories over all major Indian powers. Its administrative apparatus penetrated all spheres of life. Millions of Indians paid taxes to the company, obeyed its laws, and submitted to its courts. But beneath this glittering surface of imperial might, like steam building under the lid of a boiling pot, a deep-seated and growing discontent was accumulating. There were numerous reasons for this, affecting virtually all strata of Indian society, from princes to peasants. Economic causes. The ongoing ruin of traditional Indian crafts, especially cotton weaving, which couldn't compete with cheap factory-made textiles from Lancashire flooding the Indian market. Millions of weavers and artisans lost their livelihoods. Excessively heavy tax burdens, especially new land revenue systems like zamindari or riotuari, often led to peasant impoverishment and land passing into the hands of moneylenders or new landlords. Loss of land by many members of the old aristocracy and landowners, zamindars, talukdars, due to the company's harsh laws on tax arrears or through annexation. Political causes. The relentless annexation of Indian states, especially Lord Dalhousie's aggressive policy with his doctrine of lapse, which dispossessed many noble Indian families, e.g., the annexation of Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, Awadh. The deprivation of power, privileges, and income of the old Mughal and regional aristocracy. A pervasive sense of foreign domination, racial arrogance, and condescension from British officials and officers who often acted like lords of creation, disregarding local customs and feelings. Social and religious causes. The British, especially after 1813, when the ban on missionary activity was lifted, increasingly interfered in local social and religious customs they considered barbaric and heathen. The banning of sati, widow immolation, legislation permitting Hindu widow remarriage, the campaign to suppress the Thuggee, a secret society of ritual strangler robbers. These reforms, while perhaps progressive from a Western perspective, were seen by many conservative Hindus and Muslims as a direct assault on their faith, traditions, and way of life. Rumors spread widely, often unfounded, but no less potent for it, about British plans for the forced conversion of all Indians to Christianity, especially in schools and the army. The activities of Christian missionaries, openly criticizing Hinduism and Islam, aroused deep suspicion and hostility. Particular tension built up within the ranks of the Sepoy army itself, the main pillar of company rule. Sepoy soldiers were dissatisfied with many aspects of service, relatively low pay compared to British soldiers, worsening service conditions, loss of certain traditional privileges, like bata, extra allowance for service away from home, lack of real prospects for career advancement. All higher officer ranks were reserved exclusively for Britons. The new General Service Enlistment Act of 1856 required new recruits to agree to serve wherever needed, including overseas, e.g. in Burma, which for many high-caste Hindus was tantamount to losing caste. But the final straw, the spark that ignited the long-smoldering powder keg of discontent, came with the new cartridges for the Enfield rifle, which was being introduced into Sepoy regiments. These cartridges had a paper casing coated with grease to ease loading. Before pouring the powder and inserting the bullet into the barrel, the end of this paper cartridge had to be bitten off with the teeth. In early 1857, a rumor spread like wildfire through the Sepoy regiments, perhaps not without foundation, that the grease for these cartridges was made using a mixture of beef tallow, cow, sacred to Hindus, and pork lard, pig, unclean to Muslims. For Sepoys, both Hindu and Muslim, using such cartridges would mean terrible religious defilement, loss of caste, and loss of faith. Attempts by British officers to deny these rumors, explain that different grease was used, or find a compromise, like allowing Sepoys to grease the cartridges themselves, were often clumsy, belated, and failed to inspire trust. Tension mounted daily. In May 1857, in the large military garrison at Meerut, near Delhi, 85 Sepoys of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry publicly refused to participate in firing drills using the new cartridges. They were immediately arrested, court-martialed, and sentenced publicly to long terms of hard labor. On May 9th, they were publicly stripped of their uniforms and shackled in front of the entire garrison. This humiliation was the breaking point for their comrades. The next day, Sunday, May 10th, 1857, while British officers and soldiers were at church service, the sepoy regiments in Meerut mutinied. They freed their imprisoned comrades, killed several British officers and their families, ransacked and burned the bungalows of Europeans, and marched on Delhi, the ancient capital of India, where the descendant of the Mughals still resided. In Delhi, the local sepoy regiments immediately joined the rebels. They seized the city, killed most of the Europeans, and proclaimed the restoration of the authority of the old, frail, and powerless Emperor Bahadur Shah II. He became, reluctantly, the symbolic leader and figurehead of the uprising. This was the beginning of the Great Indian Uprising of 1857-1859, long termed the Sepoy Mutiny in British historiography, but modern scholarship recognizes it as a much broader and deeper phenomenon than just a soldier's revolt. The uprising spread with incredible speed across vast territories of northern and central India. The Doab, the land between the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, Awadh, Rohilkhand, Bundelkhand, parts of Bihar, and the central provinces. The mutinous sepoys were joined en masse by other sections of the population, disgruntled rulers and aristocrats dispossessed by the company, most famously Nana Sahib, adopted son of the last Maratha Peshwa, the talented and courageous Lakshmi Bai, Rani of Jhansi, Tantia Tope, Nana Sahib's general, landowners who had lost their lands, peasants suffering under taxes, the urban poor, religious leaders calling for jihad or the defense of Dharma. It was a powerful, though largely spontaneous, poorly coordinated, but incredibly fierce explosion of a century's worth of accumulated hatred, fear, and desperation against the foreign rule of the East India Company. The uprising was accompanied by acts of incredible brutality on both sides, leaving deep scars on the collective memory of both Britons and Indians. Rebels in many places brutally murdered not only British officers and officials, but also their wives and children. The massacre of British women and children at Kanpur, ordered by Nana Sahib, gained particular notoriety. The British, in turn, responded with equal and often greater brutality in suppressing the rebellion. They carried out mass executions without trial, burned entire villages suspected of supporting the rebels. A particularly barbaric form of execution used by the British for terror was tying captured rebels, especially sepoys, to the mouths of cannons and blowing them apart, blowing from a gun, or the devil's wind. Fierce battles were fought for every major city. The heroic defense and subsequent bloody storming of Delhi by British forces, the months-long siege and defense of the British residency in Lucknow, the desperate resistance of the Rani of Jhansi, these and many other episodes became legendary examples of incredible courage, self-sacrifice, and savage fighting. By the end of 1858 and early 1859, the main centers of rebellion had been suppressed by the superior forces of the company, and regular British troops rushed from the metropolis and other colonies. The company had an undeniable advantage in weaponry, especially artillery, organization, resources, and command. The lack of unified leadership, clear political goals, and strategic planning among the rebels, as well as internal divisions between different groups, Hindus and Muslims, aristocracy and peasantry, also played a fatal role. Furthermore, important regions of India, the Punjab, Bengal, southern India, and a significant number of Indian princes remained loyal to the British or stayed neutral. But the cost of this victory was immense, both in human lives and political consequences. The uprising of 1857 was a colossal shock to Britain. It ruthlessly exposed the fragility of British rule in India, based on a sepoy army that had now turned against its creators. It showed how deep the gulf of misunderstanding, mistrust, and hatred was between the British rulers and the Indian population. It became abundantly clear that the existing system of governing India through a private trading company, driven primarily by the pursuit of profit, had utterly failed and led to catastrophe. The days of the East India Company were numbered. The Great Uprising of 1857 sounded the death knell for the British East India Company. Although it was its army, with crucial support from regular British troops rushed to India, that ultimately drowned the rebellion in blood, it became crystal clear to everyone in London, from Queen Victoria and Prime Minister Palmerston to ordinary MPs and the public, that things could not go on like this. Governing a vast, complex, and turbulent country populated by hundreds of millions with ancient cultures and traditions, through the medium of a private commercial corporation whose primary and ultimate goal was always maximizing profit for its shareholders, proved not just ineffective, but catastrophically dangerous. This system led to a monstrous explosion that nearly cost Britain its most valuable possession. The British government and Parliament realized the urgent need to take direct and complete control of India into its own hands to restore order, the empire's prestige, and prevent similar catastrophes in the future. Public opinion in Britain itself was deeply shaken both by accounts of atrocities committed by the rebels, especially the Kanpur massacre, widely reported in the press, and by the increasingly available information about the equally horrifying retaliatory brutality shown by company troops and British soldiers during the suppression. The image of the East India Company, already tarnished in the eyes of British society by numerous corruption scandals, recall Warren Hastings' impeachment, accusations of the excessive greed of its nabob employees, and reports of famine and oppression in India, finally collapsed. The company came to be seen as an irresponsible, incompetent, and cruel entity that discredited the very name of Britain. Therefore, the decision to liquidate it as a governing power matured quickly. In August 1858, the British Parliament passed the historic Government of India Act 1858. This act put an end to the anomalous dual authority and the era of company rule. All territories under the East India Company's administration, its entire vast army, its whole administrative apparatus, all its treaties with Indian princes, and the fullness of power were transferred directly to the British Crown. India officially became part of the British Empire. The governance of India was now to be exercised in the Queen's name by a viceroy, who was also the Governor-General, appointed by the British government and responsible to the Secretary of State for India, a new member of the British Cabinet, assisted by a specially created Council of India in London. Shortly thereafter, in her famous proclamation of November 1st, 1858, Queen Victoria addressed the princes, chiefs, and people of India, promising to respect their rights, treaties, ancient customs, and religions, guaranteeing amnesty to most rebels, except those guilty of murdering Britons, and disavowing further annexations. A new era began, the era of direct British rule, known as the British Raj, which would last for almost 90 years until India gained independence in 1947. Queen Victoria formally adopted the title Empress of India somewhat later, in 1876, at the initiative of Prime Minister Disraeli. And what became of the East India Company itself? This economic and political colossus that for 2.5 centuries had been the main force of European presence in the East, that owned armadas of ships and legions of soldiers, conquered vast territories, deposed and appointed rulers, controlled trade from Indonesia to the Persian Gulf, and handled billion-pound fortunes. Formally, it ceased to exist as a governing and administrative structure immediately upon the passage of the 1858 Act. Its trading functions had long since receded into the background, having been severely curtailed by previous parliamentary acts, especially in 1813 and 1833, when it lost its monopolies on trade with India and China. Now, its last vestiges of power, its political authority and its army, the sepoy regiments were reorganized and incorporated into the new British Indian Army, were taken away. The company itself lingered on as a legal entity for a few more years, primarily engaged in winding up its financial affairs, transferring property, and settling debts and compensations for its shareholders. It was finally and ignominiously dissolved on June 1st, 1874. Thus ended this truly incredible saga. A private joint stock company, which began with the modest dream of London merchants profiting from pepper and cloves, created an empire within an empire over 2 centuries, only to be absorbed and ultimately destroyed by the very state it had essentially dragged into massive imperial ventures in the East. So, what remains of the East India Company? Its legacy is vast, multifaceted, and deeply contradictory. On the one hand, it cannot be denied that, in pursuing its own goals, it laid the foundations for modern infrastructure in India, building the first railways, telegraph lines, ports, creating a unified administrative and legal system, albeit one serving colonial interests, and facilitating the spread of Western education, though primarily to train personnel for its administration. On the other hand, its rule was an era of ruthless economic exploitation, leading to the decline of traditional Indian industries, the disruption of social structures, political subjugation, and deeply ingrained cultural arrogance and racism. It left deep scars on the collective memory of the Indian people and laid the groundwork for many economic, social, and political problems that independent India and other countries in the region, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, still grapple with today. But perhaps the main legacy of the East India Company's story is its enduring and stark reminder of the incredible, almost limitless power that corporate authority can wield when it escapes effective public and governmental control. It's a powerful warning about how the pursuit of profit, taken to the extreme, can easily cross the line into aggression, war, oppression, and altering the fates of entire civilizations. And looking at modern multinational corporations, their colossal influence on global politics, the economy, the environment, and the daily lives of billions worldwide, one can't help but wonder, are we perhaps seeing today, in the 21st century, new, possibly more sophisticated forms of that same corporate power once embodied by the Honorable East India Company, ruling the seas and half the world from its London office? So, that's the story, my friends. From a handful of adventurous merchants dreaming of fairy tale profits on pepper and cloves, to an all-powerful, unparalleled corporation empire holding the lives and destinies of hundreds of millions in its hands, the British East India Company is far more than just a chapter in a dusty history textbook. It's an epic drama of human greed and ambition, of power and its corrupting influence, of the clash of cultures, of betrayal and heroism, of incredible triumphs and devastating tragedies. It's a cautionary tale of how private enterprise, endowed with quasi-state powers and its own army, can become a force capable of literally redrawing the map of the world and changing the course of history forever. It vividly demonstrated how thin and blurred the line between trade and conquest, between the pursuit of profit and systematic oppression, can become. And although the company itself has long since vanished into oblivion, its giant, contradictory ghost still hovers over us, reminding us of the potential power of corporations and the price humanity sometimes pays for globalization and unchecked economic growth. I hope you found immersing yourselves in this story as interesting and thrilling as I found telling it. It truly is one of those sagas that makes you think deeply about the nature of power, business, and history itself, isn't it?